And I'd like to thank each and every one of you that are on the phone call today or on the webinar today for taking time out of your busy schedules to participate in this. So without any further ado, let's get started. First thing I'd like to answer is why ProDiesel? Well, we have OE quality and performance specifications at very competitive pricing. You're going to get great product engineering. You know, on most of our injectors, we put new tips in most of the injectors. Matter of fact, 65% of every injector you get back or you get from us will be all new parts. The value of what we bring to the table is we're approximately 30% lower than the OEs on their reman. And our check and advise program is really great for those guys that do not know, you know, which injector is bad, which one's not. They can send those to us. We'll check them. Small fee. We'll send you back the ones that are okay, and then we will charge you for a new injector for the ones you want to replace. We are ISO 9001 2015 certified and 14001 2015 certified. And what that means, that 14001, what it means to you is we are also EPA compliant. Most people don't know what the 14001 is, so I thought I'd answer that. And we have an 18-month fault-free warranty. We don't care if your customer does, you or your customer doesn't like what your the injector for any reason. Even if they don't like the color, they can send it back. We have a stop sign program that we added in a few years ago, and what this does is we want technicians to call us first before they remove the injector that they think may be bad, so we can go through some diagnostic procedures to try to help eliminate whether it is or is not the injector. That being said, we also know that we do not have 6 injectors fail at the same time. Our average across the board is 1.4% failure rate. It's actually less than that. So the law of averages of getting 6 in a row that are bad, pretty slim. I'd like to talk about the industry and what we know. I used to have a background in diagnostics for an aftermarket software. And what we determined at that point, and I talk about this because it's important that we all know this, it's 57% of the trucks that roll down the road today have fault codes in them. When it leaves the shop, most of the time there's $440 worth of repairs that were not fixed. That means there's $220 in parts, $220 in labor. The only way to avoid this is to scan on intake and scan it after it's completed. That way you know you've got everything done. That also helps give you a good environment to have a good running truck with good injector experience as well. And the proper thing to do is get a full diagnosis, full. And you're going to get tired of hearing me talking about root causes. Root cause is the number one thing that we have to point out. We need to figure out whether it's a fuel when you have an injector that fails. Is it a fuel-related problem, an electronic-related problem, mechanical, or is it just human error? The most obvious part of a failure is not usually the probable cause. So again, you must find the root cause before replacing the injectors. Something caused that injector to fail, whether it was dirt, contaminants, water contaminants, an electric. These injectors are made to run about 750,000 miles before they wear out. So anytime under that, there's a good chance it's not the injector that caused the initial failure. So, and if you don't fix the root cause, guess what? You're going to put in a set of injectors. You're going to have the same problem. You're going to think it's an injector problem. No, there's a root cause to it. We'll go over a little bit about what those may be as well. So today we're going to talk about diagnosis, some identification of the issues, some installation procedures, and then to make sure you get a proper functioning injector when you're done. Root cause, is it filtration, fuel pump, some oil associated with some of the HEUIs, and or connectivity issue, or just pure age? Did it finally give up the ghost? There are some common injector failures, issues we'll talk about. Broken or cracked springs, cracked bodies, solenoid issues, tips, well, some information around tips, and then some information about fuel-related pieces, and also some installation procedures. First thing I'd like to go over is what a seized injector looks like. These are a couple pictures of what they look like. You see that they're not all the way up to the springs. It's not opened back up. You'll normally notice these will be real noisy. It's going to run rough. There's going to be misfiring going on. The reason is the seized plunger is not matching the body. It's actually stuck in there. Most of the time when that happens, if it's within the first 1,000 miles after you've replaced the injector, it's more common that it's a fuel-related issue and it's got a piece of dirt contaminated in there that has locked that up and won't let it come back up and flow freely. You're going to have to replace the injector. You need to check for water in the fuel or the fuel temperature. If it gets too hot, you don't have a problem there as well. A broken follow spring. The spring there that you can see the pictures there where they're broken. You'll normally see or notice this. You'll get fuel in your oil, or mainly in a Series 60, or you'll get a tapping or slapping noise. The injector follower spring has just failed for whatever reason, age, it was, who knows what. Sometimes they just do. You'll need to replace the injector, and you'll need to check the springs of all the rest of them. So they may be all at an age where they're all starting to fail. So missing or loose or missing top plate screws, you're going to get fuel in your oil again. You're going to get a stop, those have either backed off or they've been over torqued or damaged under torqued. So what I'll tell you is don't mess with these screws. They're set from the factory. We torque them down to the proper specs, thinking that turning them a little bit more might help. It'll flatten the O-ring in there incorrectly. They'll be improperly torqued all the way around, and you'll have the same issue. Or most of these break if you get them just a little too tight. They break right off. Of course, you can see what to do there. You'll have to replace it. Check all the others as well. A cracked injector body. These are real hard to see sometimes because you have to take them out, clean them, and really inspect them. This picture here shows just a fine hairline crack. Again, you'll get fuel in the oil. Excessive pressure is what's caused it. It could just be old and fatigued. You'll also want to check for more cracks in the other injectors in the system as well. This one is a common one we see from time to time. We see it'll be you'll get rough running, you'll get a misfiring. Someone over torqued the screw when they put it during installation, or they've been over the terminal and broke it during that time. Those are very small little screws. It doesn't take a lot of torque, and as you can see, there's the specs for that. Failed or blown spray tip failures. So here's an interesting one. Of course, it's going to run rough, misfire, low horsepower, or black smoke. The reason it happened is the unit was damaged during the installation. We see a lot of people that'll bump these or drop them or hit them when before they install them. It could just be fatigue. Sometimes you get close to that 750,000 miles, they start to wear out. The other is a water contamination. If you get water in your system and it gets all the way to the injector, of course, water is not going to compress and it's going to blow that tip and tear it up. Or you've got a dropped intake or exhaust valve, which could hit it as well. And of course, you need to check all the rest of them to make sure that you don't have that same issue in some of the others. A low pressure plug leak, you're going to notice fuel in the oil again. You're going to have the main reason here is it's gotten old and it's fatigued, and you need to check all the rest of them because that means they're probably all about that same age and that same issue. High pressure plug leak, again, fuel in the oil. This could have happened from a bad braze. It could just be fatigue. So you'll need to check to see what you've got. Again, check the rest of them. These are just some of we're going over the highlights of seeing how these work and what you actually see as a failure. Here, trim codes. We've been asked a lot about trim codes. Wanted to talk about that. This is something that you must do on certain engines. Detroit and Cat, only certain platforms of those actually need those as well. You'll need software to install those. Most of the time, it's the OE software. There is Cojali. It will do Cat as well as far as putting the trim codes in, and it must be done to have the engine run right. The reason that is you're telling the ECU that you have a new player, that it needs to learn, that it's going to run a little different. It's going to play that when you put a trim coat in. It knows where to start the process. Also, if you buy CAT engines from us, you need the trim coat, we will send the disc with the trim coat. We have all the OE trim coats for those. The key here is to make sure that if it needs it, we always send it. If it doesn't need it, we don't send it. We get phone calls, hey, I didn't get a trim coat with my CAT injector. You're not supposed to with that injector. It doesn't need a trim coat. On the international HEUIs, a lot of times you get a split tip, and this is normally due to a low fuel pressure, air in the fuel most likely, or it's misaligned, or a worn injector tube. If you're putting another set in and the injector tube's worn a little bit, it's going to cause a misalignment. If you've dry started this engine, where you just turn it over when you put them in and you haven't done the right things, you will cause this to tip to crack. The reason that is the hydraulic cushion caused by the fuel oil. Dry starts will pop these things in a heartbeat. If split tips will happen no matter who you buy these from, whether you buy them from us or you buy them from anyone else, they will happen on a dry start. The corrective thing to do so you can avoid that is to prime the engine before you start the engine, operate the engine with proper fuel pressure. Make sure that you know you're getting the right pressure. Low fuel pressure will cause this because, again, you're not getting the cushion. And you can see you need to replace the fuel filter, clean the fuel strainer, check the lift pump, or you've got air in the fuel. If you get air in the fuel, you're going to get the same thing as happened on dry start. Cummins SELECT injectors. This is really critical that you guys follow these installation procedures. I won't read all of those. I'll cover the first three that are most important. Torque to hold down clamps, and there's the torque settings. Replace the SELECT injectors. When you're doing that, make sure you disconnect the battery for at least 5 minutes. The reason you do is it allows the computer to reset. Now understand, the reason the number 3 line there is bold, it's obnoxious, it's rude. I did that on purpose. We get more phone calls after someone has changed to a Cummins SELECT injector and they haven't driven it for 50 miles. Again, the ECU needs to understand that you got a new player in here and it's trying to adjust the fuel. Sometimes it takes 50 miles, sometimes it takes 15. You'll know when it settles in and it understands and it's learned that you have a new injector. Nothing wrong with the injector. It's the computer that's trying to tell the injector how to fire. So that's the important part. Make sure you drive it for 50 miles before you even start doing any other further tests. And then you can see the rest of the stuff there that you can do to help make sure you get a good experience with replacing injectors. Some other common failures, on Cummins SELECT, we get a lot of failures from where they have had a bad wiring harness or a damaged solenoid, and these are just pictures of CAT 3406E. Damaged or tipped during installation. There's another one where the tip's been dropped and it's been done. Cracked or tip over on the other picture. So just a little bit to understand what you're looking at when you see some of these and what those failures may be. So let's talk about some of the other stuff we see going down the road. If you're getting black or gray smoke, you need to really check your fuel to make sure you've got the proper grade. Sample the fuel, submit the fuel sample for testing. If it's an improper grade in a fuel, it's a lot of steps there that you're going to have to take. You're going to have to flush that system and start all over. Fuel filters, fuel lines, refuel, do the fuel tanks over and test it again to make sure it's running and working correctly. It could also be from a faulty injector with a blown nozzle or a plugged nozzle. White smoke, a little bit more involved here. You can check for improper fuel grade again. The same things go there, but it could also be aerated fuel. Always refer, of course, to your OEM guidelines on how to check for aerated fuel. But here's a list of a couple things: disconnect fuel line, return hose. I thought this was a really great way to test. You should set the container above the engine and run it for 1,000 RPM. You'll see at 1,000 RPM, you'll see if there's foam or bubbles in that fuel, you'll know that you're getting air in your fuel. Then there's a lot of little things you need to check. Tighten all the fuel line connections between the fuel tank and the fuel pump. Visually inspect all these other little items here and repair any damaged components. If the smoke, and if it still smokes and it has passed the aeration test, you need to check for improper calibration on your injectors. So before replacing injectors, again, determine the root cause of the failure. Please correct any possible contamination issues. Metal, failed high pressure pumps, all that. Here's, poor fuel handling, flush the system. These are really critical things to do. We find so much that goes wrong because people just didn't take the time to look at their fuel and make sure the fuel's right. So, and the reason we do that, and the reason we know that is, people say, well, why did they fail right out of the box? Well, 65% of everything we get back from ProVantage warranty, everything everybody turns back in, we actually check to see what's wrong with those injectors. 65% of that is a non-injector related issue. It's contamination, it's O-ring damage, diagnostics, it's been improperly diagnosed that there was a problem to begin with, or it's an inherent OEM injector problem. Understand, whether you buy certain injectors from us or the OE, if it was a poorly designed injector, we can't redesign the injector. We can just make it run as good as it can to match what the OE spec says. We can't change a HEUI from being a HEUI. It is what it is. And here's a good graph that shows that. But let's talk about what makes up the 65%. The number one thing is contamination. It makes 60% of everything we get back on that fail warranty-wise. It's either storage. Do you buy your bulk in fuel? Your fuel in bulk, sorry. Is it a reliable source? Is it the right type of fuel, highway, off-highway? And do you have the right additives in it? Particulates, and we'll go over that a little bit more, and then water in the fuel. We'll go over a little bit more of these. When I talked about fuel storage, one of the things that puzzled me the most, and as I went and researched all of this, I was looking at diesel fuel, and the latest study shows that it degrades 26% in the first 28 days. And 95% of all fuel has water in it. But those two things being said, we know that people are not using enough additives and enough filtration to get good, proper fuel. What's changed over the last few years? 20, 30 years ago, you could have kept fuel for 10 years and it would have been fine. Today, it's changed because they use hydrocracking, which splits the molecules, so it's faster and easier for them to make fuel. It also is a lot less stable because of that. The most common fuel-related issues with particulates is you need to test your fuel. You need to change your filters by OE recommendations. Some of them are as little as 10 to 20,000 miles. Flush the system. If you're putting new injectors in, flush the system, clean the installation area, clean the fuel line connectors. And before you go and unwrap that injector, put new gloves, clean your hands, do whatever it takes to keep this thing clean. My wife is a nurse, and we call this sterile technique. You need to do it like you're trying to keep them perfectly clean, because that's exactly what you need to do. Remember, some of these electronic injectors have a 2 to 5 micron tip. Again, that's dust off of a rag. It takes 20,000 microns to equal an inch. It's amazing what little it takes. And by the way, if you're using a 10 micron filter and you've got a 5 micron tip on your injector, and you're putting 10 micron filters in them because they're less expensive, they don't clog as quickly. You're right, they don't, but the fuel injectors become the most expensive fuel filter on the truck. That will clog the smallest particle filters, what's going to catch the most dirt. Unwrap the injector, like I said, only when you're ready to put it in the engine. Don't take it out, lay it on your cart, lay it on the top of the engine. Take it out of the wrapper as you're sticking it into the into the cylinder. Okay. When I talked about the 2 to 5 micron filters, I want you guys to see a little bit about what goes on inside ProDiesel. You'll notice a microscope over on the side, but we use a negative pressure room with special cleaning rags with no dust. Some of the tips go all the way down to 2 microns. And this is some of the parts that you can see next to the dime there that show you how small the parts and pieces are. We actually use tea strainers to wash those parts. And it's pretty amazing to see how they can put those things together. I understand why they have a microscope. I just don't have that. My hands are too shaky to be able to do anything like that. I don't have the dexterity. Let's talk a little bit about water, microbes, and sludge. Okay, water is in, like I said, 95% of every fuel has water in it. So that increases your ability to get microbial infections. Bacteria and fungi can go crazy in there. It accelerates the oxidation breakdown, which makes it, we don't want it breaking down any faster, and contributes to tank corrosion. Also, microbes, they're, because we're using low sulfur fuels nowadays, they wreak havoc. You guys really need to be treating your fuel and making sure that you've got good quality fuel and it's working right. And sludge, of course, you can see that it'll plug filters like crazy. It can also be spread. Microbes and sludge both can be spread from one truck to another, so be careful on that. So the questions I always say is, that you guys need to ask yourself. Have you checked your tanks lately? Or if you're buying in bulk, have you checked them to see what was going on with them? If there's anything in there that water, dirt, contaminants. When was the last time you had your fuel tested to see if you've got an infection going on in there or something like that? What can you expect if the fuel is bad? You're going to be dumping some fuel. You're going to have to either treat it, try to get rid of it. You're going to have to figure out what you do with those. And there's different ways of handling that. Have you checked for microbes? Which is best for you? There's mechanical washing and chemical solutions that wash your fuel. And can you do it yourself, or do you have to pay someone? Those are the things that I go. And believe it or not, we just would love it if you filter, because your bad experience with a set of injectors, as we just looked, if you have a bad experience with a set of injectors, it's probably contamination more than anything else, most likely cause. So the second one of that part that we get back is during installation. The most common, you'll get a cut or a flattened O-ring. It's normally in the back cylinders where it's harder to reach, harder to get to. You can get combustion heat and can result in these getting the O-rings torn up. Trust me, when we test our injectors, after they've been in the test machine, we take them out, we put all new O-rings on it, brand new, the proper O-rings, and then they're sealed. And they put tip protectors on it, and they're sealed. So we know it's got brand new O-rings, it's clean, it's tested, it's met, it's matched, it's ready to go. So that means these things had to have happened out in the field. Every time you pull the injector out, put new O-rings on it, and use a small coat of ethylene glycol petroleum jelly on the O-rings to help it slide in easily, so you don't nick or cut one. Another one that we get some of the more common little off-site issues are a bad wiring harness. You'll see several of those. Some of the Detroits and some of the Cummins are really bad about it, and you need to make sure you've got a good wiring harness that works well before you try to install injectors. Injector tubes, make sure you look for any of those that are worn. You need to replace those. Check for good grounding. You'll get misfires if you don't have a good ground on there. This part number that you see over here, it's a bad part number. It's been known for a while. I just bring it to your attention. And again, I go back to if you're putting Cummins SELECT injectors, please drive it for 50 miles before after you put the injectors in it before you call anybody or do anything. That is a must. On a Cat C7, make sure that you're looking at your high pressure fuel pump. You want to make sure that they will destroy themselves after 150,000 miles. They start throwing metal into the engine, and it'll clog an injector in a heartbeat. So if you put new injectors in it, you want to make sure you look at your pump and probably just replace it at the same time. Some other common installation issues that we've seen and heard about that you guys need to be aware of. You check your fuel equalizer, make sure it's not plugged or frozen. Check your fuel pressure, make sure you're getting adequate fuel pressure. And use the correct diagnostic software, OE quality, or qualified aftermarket software. Keep it up to date, use the proper connectors. When you need to have a trim code, we'll send you the trim code. And you need to find the root cause. Not finding the root cause is the #1 issue because, like I said, with contaminants, 65% of that is contaminants that cause the problem. That's a root cause, not just the injector. So that's kind of what I have for you today. I will, you got any comments, you can email me at georgefarmer@gsspro